Man insults Morgan Freeman in a high-end restaurant. His reaction is shocking. The restaurant hummed with quiet sophistication. Soft jazz floated through the air, mixing with the delicate clinking of silverware against fine china. Candlelight flickered on polished mahogany tables, casting warm golden glows on the faces of well-dressed patrons. The scent of seared steak and aged wine drifted through the room, wrapping everything in an air of exclusivity. At the far end of the restaurant, nestled in a private booth, sat Morgan Freeman. His unmistakable voice carried just enough for nearby diners to catch snippets of his deep, melodic laughter. People stole glances. Some whispered in hushed excitement. The presence of a Hollywood legend had shifted the atmosphere, though Morgan himself seemed completely at ease, his rich baritone weaving through casual conversation. Across the room, sitting alone at the bar, was Daniel Carter, a man in his mid-40s. His suit slightly rumpled, his drink half-finished. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, eyes narrowed, staring across the restaurant. His fingers tapped against the counter in an erratic rhythm. His jaw set tight. The bartender glanced at him once, sensing something off, but said nothing. Daniel's gaze didn't waver. He watched as waiters moved swiftly to attend to Morgan's table, their smiles a little wider, their steps a little quicker. A couple at a nearby table leaned in, pretending not to eavesdrop, but their eyes gleamed with recognition. The whole place seemed to bend around Morgan Freeman, as if the air itself held him in quiet reverence. Welcome back to PlotTwister. Before we unravel today's mystery, don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the notification bell so you're always in the loop. Daniel exhaled sharply through his nose, his grip tightening around his glass. His lips pressed into a thin line, the muscles in his jaw flexing. The room may have been full, but he had never felt more invisible. A waiter passed him by without a glance. Another man at the bar laughed loudly, completely unaware of Daniel's presence. His fingers drummed faster, his eyes darkened. Across the room, Morgan Freeman chuckled again, his voice as smooth as velvet. The sound rippled through the restaurant, warm and effortless. Daniel's breath caught. His grip tightened. His chest rose and fell with something unspoken. The ice in his glass clinked softly. And then, without a word, he pushed back his chair. The chair scraped loudly against the floor as Daniel stood. A few heads turned, but most remained absorbed in quiet conversations. The gentle hum of the restaurant undisturbed. He took a breath, then started walking. His steps were steady, deliberate. His eyes locked on Morgan Freeman's table. The air felt heavier with each step. A waiter passed in front of him, balancing a tray of expensive wine. But Daniel barely noticed. The closer he got, the louder his heartbeat drummed in his ear. At the table, Morgan leaned back, his deep chuckle rolling through the space like a slow wave. His friend, an older gentleman with silver hair, smiled as they exchanged stories, oblivious to the storm approaching. Daniel stopped at the edge of the table. Silence seemed to wrap around him like a coil, tightening with every passing second. A woman at a nearby table glanced up, then nudged her companion. The conversation at the next table faltered. A sense of unease rippled outward, subtle but growing. Daniel's voice cut through the quiet. "You think you're better than everyone else, don't you?" The words dropped like a stone into a still pond. The hum of the restaurant faded as heads turned, eyes widening. A waiter, mid-step, hesitated, glancing between Daniel and the table. The silver-haired man blinked, startled. Morgan, however, didn't move. Daniel's voice rose, tight with something he couldn't quite contain. "You sit here, laughing like you know what real life is, like you understand what people go through, but you don't. You're just another out-of-touch celebrity who has no idea what it's like to struggle." The restaurant was silent now. The clinking of silverware had stopped. A woman near the bar covered her mouth, her eyes darting toward the scene. A manager lingered near the entrance, tense, ready to step in. Morgan finally lifted his gaze. His deep brown eyes met Daniel's, steady, unshaken. The expression on his face wasn't anger. It wasn't offense. It was something else, something unreadable. For a long moment he said nothing. The weight of that silence was heavier than any words that could have followed. The silence stretched thick and suffocating. All around people had sat frozen, their eyes darting between Daniel and Morgan Freeman. The air in the restaurant, once filled with soft conversation and warmth, now felt cold, brittle, like the moment before a storm. Daniel's breath came hard and fast. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. He had expected something. Anger, a sharp retort, maybe even security stepping in. But instead, Morgan just sat there, watching him, his expression calm, unreadable. A long moment passed before Morgan finally spoke, his voice deep and even. "Son, what's troubling you?" The words landed softly but carried weight, filling the space between them. Daniel blinked. His chest rose and fell, the tight coil in his stomach twisted. This wasn't the response he had expected. Across the room, someone coughed. A fork scraped against a plate, a nervous, accidental sound. The restaurant manager took a slow step forward, uncertain whether to intervene. A waiter hovered near the bar, gripping a cloth napkin so tightly his knuckles turned white. Daniel let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Don't do that. Don't act like you care." Morgan didn't look away, didn't flinch. He simply tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady. "You don't know what it's like to be nothing, to work your whole life and have nothing to show for it." Daniel's voice wavered, his frustration laced with something else now, something raw. Morgan studied him for a moment, then did something no one expected. He gestured to the empty seat across from him. A simple motion, unhurried, an invitation. "Sit with me." A murmur rippled through the restaurant. Someone at a nearby table leaned in, eyes wide. The manager hesitated, his fingers twitching at his sides, unsure whether to stop this or let it unfold. Daniel stared at the open seat, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. His fingers twitched, his breath shuddered. The restaurant, the people, the tension, it all blurred around him. Then, after a long, arching pause, he pulled out the chair and sat down. Daniel sat stiffly, his hands clasped together on the table. His pulse pounded in his ears. Across from him, Morgan Freeman leaned back slightly, his deep brown eyes steady, patient. The quiet in the restaurant remained thick with curiosity. Morgan didn't speak right away. He let the moment breathe, let Daniel feel the weight of his own presence at the table. Daniel exhaled sharply, shaking his head. He wasn't sure why he had sat down. His body had moved before his mind had caught up. Now, with all eyes on him, he felt exposed. He reached for his drink but stopped halfway. His fingers curled into a fist on the table instead. "You ever feel like the world just doesn't see you?" His voice was lower now. The anger beneath is dimming. Morgan nodded slightly, as if encouraging him to go on. Daniel swallowed hard. He hadn't meant to say that, but the words kept coming, as if the silence demanded them. "I lost my job 6 months ago. I gave 20 years to that company. 20 years! And they cut me loose like I was nothing. My wife left not long after that. Said I wasn't the same man anymore." His laugh was hollow. Maybe she was right. Morgan listened, unmoving, his expression unreadable. Not a trace of pity, just quiet understanding. Daniel rubbed a hand over his face, his exhaustion suddenly heavier. "I don't even know why I came here tonight. I guess I don't know. I saw you sitting here, laughing, enjoying yourself, and it just..." He stopped, shaking his head. Morgan finally spoke, his voice smooth and measured. "So you thought I didn't know struggle?" Daniel glanced up, his jaw still tight, but he didn't answer. Morgan's voice was steady, rich with something deeper than just words. "Hardship doesn't care about fame, son. It finds everyone." Daniel's breath hitched. Morgan leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough that only Daniel could hear. "The real question is, are you going to let it define you?" Daniel sat there staring, something shifting deep inside him. The weight in his chest, the bitterness in his bones, it didn't disappear. But for the first time in months, it didn't feel quite so heavy. Daniel stared at the table, his fingers tracing the rim of his glass. The weight of Morgan's words settled deep in his chest, pressing against something raw, something he had buried under months of anger. The restaurant was still watching, but the world around him felt smaller now, quieter. Just him and the man across from him. His throat tightened. He forced out a breath, then let out a quiet, bitter chuckle. "It's funny. I've been a fan of yours my whole life." Morgan didn't react, just listened. Watched all your movies, listened to your interviews. Used to think you had the kind of voice that could make anything feel possible. Daniel's fingers curled around his glass. His jaw tensed. But life has a way of making you forget what you used to believe in. The words hung between them, heavier than the silence before. Morgan nodded, slowly as if absorbing every syllable. Then he spoke, his voice steady, calm. You haven't forgotten. You're just looking for a reason to believe again. Daniel's breath hitched. His fingers loosened. Something inside him cracked, just enough to let the light in. He exhaled long and slow. The tension in his shoulders eased, just a little. For the first time that night, he lifted his gaze and met Morgan's eyes. I'm sorry. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it was real. Morgan didn't hesitate. He reached across the table, his hand open, steady. Without thinking, Daniel took it. The restaurant, once filled with hushed tension, began to shift. Conversations resumed, the clinking of glasses returned. The world, it seemed, had taken a breath with them. Morgan gave his hand a firm squeeze, then leaned back, a small, knowing smile on his face. Daniel sat there a moment longer. The bitterness, the weight, it wasn't gone. But something was different now. As he stood to leave, he looked at Morgan one last time. A silent thank you. Morgan simply nodded. And with that, Daniel walked out of the restaurant, not as a man who had entered, but as someone who, for the first time in a long time, wasn't entirely lost. What are your thoughts on the twist we uncovered today? Comment your ideas below. Make sure to like and subscribe for a daily dose of drama and mystery. See you later with another twist.